Hello, my name is Greta Wagner, and I am going to talk to you today about tax guidance for ministers of the gospel. I am interested in this topic, and I became interested in this topic because I had 3 brothers who went into the ministry, and I wanted to be able to help them with their taxes. So I went to school at UW-Milwaukee, and I got my master's in accounting. And then while I was studying accounting, I kind of learned as much as I could about minister of the gospel taxes. And then I went on to get my CPA. I worked at a public accounting firm, Deloitte, for a couple of years. And then I started teaching accounting at WLC. I still teach there, a couple tax classes there part-time. And then I also help in the tax department at Client First. Today we're going to work through some best practices and tips on a minister of the gospel return. So the 3 main issues that we're going to discuss today is a minister of the gospel is considered self-employed in relation to employment taxes and must determine their withholding. So a large part of this presentation is going to be figuring out what kind of withholding estimates you're going to have to make, either through your paycheck or through quarterly estimated withholding. And then a minister of the gospel is eligible to have a portion of their compensation designated as a housing allowance under IRS Section 107 and therefore excluded from federal income tax purposes. So we're going to talk a little bit about the housing allowance. And then finally, a minister of the gospel is allowed to deduct work-related expenses. Are ministers of the gospel's employees or are they self-employed? They are both. They have a dual tax status. So they are considered employees for federal income tax purposes and other tax and fringe benefit purposes, but they are considered self-employed for employment tax purposes, which is your Social Security and Medicare tax. So we are going to compare the 2 tax statuses. I'm hoping this will give you a good idea of the differences between the 2 and what you maybe would be more familiar with and what the minister of the gospel status looks like. An employee pays all of their federal income taxes and 1/2 of their Social Security and Medicare taxes, also called FICA taxes, and the employer pays the other 1/2 of their FICA taxes. Federal and state income taxes are withheld and paid by the employee, and then 7.65% of FICA taxes are withheld and paid by the employee, and 7.65% of FICA taxes are paid by the employer. So an employee pays all their federal and state, and then 1/2 of their FICA taxes. So here's an example of an employee's W-2. You can see that their wages or their salary was $40,000, and then they had federal income tax withheld in box 2 of $3,200. They had Social Security tax withheld of $2,480, and that is 6.2% of the $40,000. And then they had Medicare tax withhold of $580, and that's 1.45%. So 6.2% plus 1.45% is our 7.65%. So that's the 1/2 of the FICA taxes. And then on the bottom, we have state income tax withheld on that $40,000 salary of $1,600. So in contrast, a self-employed individual pays all of their federal income taxes and state income taxes and the entire amount of their Social Security and Medicare taxes. And instead of being called FICA taxes, they're called SECA taxes. So federal and state income taxes are paid by the self-employed taxpayer. So that's the same as an employee. But then 15.3%, or twice the employee rate, of SECA taxes are paid by the self-employed taxpayer. And then a self-employed taxpayer typically reports their income on Schedule C and pays self-employment taxes on Schedule SE. So these are schedules in the 1040 tax return. A minister of the gospel pays their own federal and state income taxes and the entire amount of their Social Security and Medicare taxes, or SECA taxes, just like a self-employed individual. However, there are some unique rules for the minister of the gospel. They are considered employees for income tax purposes. For instance, ministers of the gospels will receive a W-2, are eligible for employee benefits such as insurance and pension benefits, and are allowed to exclude items employees typically exclude, such as retirement contributions. But then they are considered self-employed insofar as deducting job-related expenses from their income. They are also allowed to exclude a housing allowance when calculating their federal income taxes, not when calculating their SECA taxes. So here's an example of what a minister of the gospel W-2 would look like. We have the same $40,000 salary. However, this minister has declared a $24,000 housing allowance, and you can see that in box 14. So their wages in box 1 have been reduced to $16,000, and their state wages in box 16 have been reduced to $16,000. All the other boxes are blank, but they do have federal income tax withheld in box 2, and this is actually a combination of their federal income taxes, their Social Security tax, and their Medicare tax. So all withholding can be lumped together, and then it's reported in box 2. Alternatively, a minister of gospel can make quarterly estimates instead. So you can either have it withheld from the paycheck, and it would be reported in box 2 of the W-2, or they can make their own quarterly estimated payments and then report those to their tax preparer at the end of the year. The following explains how to estimate federal withholding and state withholding. There are 3 estimates to be made. The federal income tax. This is based on each taxpayer's unique tax situation, so the marital status, dependents, deductions, and credits. One way this can be estimated is by multiplying the taxpayer's effective tax rate by his or her taxable income, which is the salary less the housing allowance. So in this example, it would be the effective tax rate times the $16,000. The effective tax rate can be determined using a prior year tax return. Divide federal taxes by taxable income. This is a number that you can get from your tax preparer, or you can go back and calculate it from your prior year tax return. Another way to estimate federal income tax is by looking at the previous year's W-2. This method works well for an employee switching to a minister of the gospel. So for many of the female called workers who were previously employees and they're now ministers of the gospel, looking at a prior year W-2 can help estimate your voluntary withholding. So in this example, I looked at the employee W-2 where $3,200 of federal income taxes were withheld on the $40,000 salary. So I back into this and determine that it's an 8% withholding rate, and then I use that same rate when calculating federal income taxes on the $16,000 of taxable income, which is $16,000 times 8%, so I come up with $1,280 of federal income tax. And then the second type of tax that we have to estimate is the Social Security and Medicare tax. So this is the full SECA tax rate of 15.3%, and it is calculated using the entire salary. So we add back the housing allowance to calculate Social Security and Medicare tax. $40,000 times 15.3% is $6,120. You'll notice that this is exactly twice the Social Security and Medicare taxes withheld on the employee W-2. So if you add the employee W-2 numbers together, that's the 7.65% withholding rate. For ministers of the gospel, we're going to have the 15.3% rate for SECA tax. And then the third type of tax we need to estimate is the state income tax. This is also based on each taxpayer's unique tax situation. So similar to the federal income tax, one way it can be estimated is by multiplying the taxpayer's state effective tax rate by his or her taxable income. So $16,000 again in this case. The effective tax rate can be determined from a prior year tax return. Divide state taxes paid by state taxable income. Another way to estimate state income taxes is also by looking at the previous year's W-2. Again, this method works well for an employee switching to a minister of the gospel. In this example, I looked at the employee W-2 where $1,600 of state income taxes were withheld on the $40,000 salary. So I backed into that rate. It's a 4% withholding rate, and then I used that same rate when calculating state income taxes on the $16,000 of taxable income. So $16,000 times 4% is $640. The total amount of federal withholding, so the amount that I had in that box 2, is the sum of the federal income tax calculated in step 1 plus the self-employment tax calculated in step 2 for a total of $7,400. One of the most important takeaways is that the federal income tax is based on the salary less the housing allowance, so $16,000 in this example, and the self-employment taxes, or the SECA taxes, are based on the total salary of $40,000. Although the self-employment taxes are a straightforward calculation at 15.3%, the federal income tax depends on your tax situation. So I'm giving you a number of ways to estimate this. For the most accurate estimate, I recommend consulting a tax professional. The benefit of being considered a minister of the gospel is that the housing allowance is excluded from federal income tax. $24,000 is excluded from the $40,000 salary in this example. The downside is that the minister of the gospel pays a full 15.3% of Social Security and Medicare taxes instead of half that rate at 7.65%. However, most calling bodies will add the employer's share of Social Security and Medicare to the minister's salary. For example, to make the $40,000 salary comparable with an employee's $40,000 salary, the calling body would include $40,000 times 7.65%, or $3,060 as additional compensation. So I want to show you a side-by-side of the two W-2s. You can see on the right-hand side that $7,400 consisted of our estimated federal taxes and then our SECA taxes. When broken down, it's Social Security of $4,960 and Medicare of $1,160. So total, that's our 15.3% plus our estimated federal taxes. I wanted to show you the benefit here and the tax savings of being a minister of the gospel, and that it is worth the additional administrative burden. So we have on the employee W-2, $3,200 of federal income tax withheld, and on the minister of the gospel W-2, $1,280 of federal taxes withheld. So if we take the difference between those, we have a $1,290 tax savings. Another way to look at it is that your housing allowance of $24,000 is being excluded from income tax at a tax rate of 8%, which also is $1,290 of tax savings. The previous slides show a very simple example of a minister of the gospel's salary. In reality, taxable income needs to consider a number of factors. So it's not very likely that it'll just be a $40,000 salary without any additional components. So a minister's of the gospel's taxable income may include salary and wages, excluding the housing allowance, a SECA allowance, so that would be if the calling body adds an additional 7.65% to your salary to account for their share of the SECA taxes, phone reimbursement under a non-accountable plan, and car reimbursement under a non-accountable plan would be included in salary, and then moving expense reimbursements are also included in salary. A minister of the gospel's taxable income may exclude the housing allowance, the pre-tax retirement contributions, so contributions to 403B plans, church-paid group term life insurance premiums. It can exclude phone reimbursement under an accountable plan and car reimbursement under an accountable plan, health insurance premiums under Section 125, and FSA or HSA contributions under Section 125. And then keep in mind that the housing allowance needs to be added back for the SECA tax calculation. So how do we determine this housing allowance? We've been talking about the housing allowance. In our previous example, it was $24,000, but how do we get to that number? The IRS allows a portion of a minister of the gospel's compensation to be tax exempt. This amount is the lesser of actual expenses incurred to maintain a home, fair rental value of a home, furnished plus utilities, and the amount designated at the beginning of the year. So the amount that you are actually allowed to deduct is going to be the lesser of these three items. And we're going to talk about each of these 3 items. So actual housing expenses, you've probably seen a list like this before, but I just wanted to put it out there. They include rent, mortgage, property taxes, homeowner's insurance, down payment, utilities, home phone, cable, lawn and garden, repairs, improvements, maintenance, cleaning supplies, appliances, dishes and cookware, bedding and towels, decorating items, and furniture. The second item that we're looking at is the fair rental value of the home plus furnishings and utilities. So the fair rental value of property is a question of facts and circumstances. There is no fixed formula or method, so it can be a little tricky to determine. It can be obtained from a local realtor or appraiser by looking at comparable rental listings in the area or by looking up fair market rents on huduser.gov. And you might want to utilize a couple of these to make sure that you are on the right track. Those amounts are all going to get you the fair rental value of the home, and then an additional amount should be added for the fair rental value of all the furnishings in the home and the actual cost of utilities. So one way to get the fair rental value of the furnishings is you could see how much it would cost to rent furniture from a rental company, or you just add an amount that you think is reasonable for renting the furnishings in the home. Again, this number is a little tricky to determine, and we oftentimes don't need this number because one of the other 2 are going to be the number that we use. We are most concerned with this number when it could be the lesser of the 3 housing allowance numbers. So in a situation where the other 2 numbers are inflated, for instance, when someone puts a down payment on their home, then the actual expenses are very high. So in that case, the fair rental value of the home plus furnishings and utilities is likely going to be the lesser of the 3. And finally, the designated housing allowance. This is a specific amount of the minister's salary that must be officially designated in writing at the beginning of the year or in advance of the payment. A minister can declare any amount they would like, but receive the greatest benefit if it is set to cover the maximum expenses, plus extra for unknown expenses that may occur during the year. So I always say it's best to overestimate your expenses. Any amount not utilized will be added to taxable income when the annual tax return is filed. And the final topic is deducting work-related expenses. Similar to a self-employed taxpayer, ministers of the gospel can deduct expenses related to their job, including business mileage. Commuting to and from a taxpayer's home to a place of work is not deductible. However, additional miles for conferences, shut-ins, hospitals, field trips, and other church and school events are deductible. Business use of cell phone. This is another tricky one to determine. You can take your cell phone bill, take out the portion that's related to you, so exclude the other family members' portion of the bill, and then you sort of estimate your personal use versus your business use. So you can look at some cell phone bills, or you can just come up with a reasonable estimate of what percentage of your phone you use for personal use and what percentage of your phone you use for business use, and then you can just multiply that percentage times your cell phone bill. Other deductions are conferences and seminars, continuing education, hotel and travel expenses, meals while traveling, books and publications, gowns and cleaning, classroom supplies, and office supplies. Ministers should keep track of these expenses throughout the year and then provide them to their tax preparer at the end of the year. Thank you for listening to this presentation today. This was a high-level overview of some of the issues surrounding minister of the gospel taxes. I would highly recommend that at least the first year that you are a minister of the gospel, you have a tax professional work through this with you. We here at Client First would be happy to do that for you. I would be happy to do that for you. So feel free to reach out to them, to reach out to me if you need some help with your tax return. Client First does a number of other services. You can schedule a no-fee initial consultation, work with your Client First team to customize a true holistic plan for you, receive ongoing updates to your plan as your life changes, and enjoy your new financial confidence. So there's a phone number and an email at the bottom there as well. Thank you for listening.